Hi, Ibby.
Hi, Joe.
Who are you?
I'm Ibby. I'm a linguist, and I like playing games. Who are you?
I'm Joe. I'm a game designer, and I like designing games and occasionally playing them.
No.
And I also speak a language.
Yeah.
Okie dokie.
What are we gaming and linguisting today?
We are doing a game called Heaven's Vault.
Yeah, so Heaven's Vault, whether you've played it or not, just for the people who haven't, it's a game by a studio called Inkle. They make a lot of different narrative games, usually with some sort of literary bent. They made 80 Days based on the Phileas Fogg stories, Overboard, which is a funny little game about a mischievous flapper killing a husband on a boat and trying to cover it up. Yeah, they made Sorcery, which is an adaptation of an older game, something called Pendragon. And one of the great things they do as a studio is they seem to collect narrative designers from all walks and make them make things in their engines. So, for example, we've got First Draft of the Revolution, which I haven't played yet, but that's made by Emily Short, whose kind of career in narrative design is really impressive and has done loads of really cool talks on it as well. It came out in 2019. So although I think we're going to try and avoid really major spoilers in this conversation, but you also should have played it by now, although we only played it last year, so we can't really speak.
No.
This year?
Both.
And you can play it on the Switch, you can play it on the PS4, and you can play it on a PC on Windows.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe let's start with thinking about, to those who don't know the game, doing a little elevator pitch. How would you describe Heaven's Vault?
Okay. Yeah, it's quite an odd game. I'll try and describe it in one sentence because that's usually how elevator pitches work. So it's a point-and-click adventure game, so similar to the old Monkey Island games from the 90s or those newer Walking Dead games that came out about 10 years ago. But in this one, you're deciphering an ancient language, and then you're also using that language to try and decipher the history of this kind of science fantasy world that you're in.
Yeah, that's good. I was thinking, imagine there was a Harrison Ford cinematic universe where the main character is both Deckard from Blade Runner, but also Indiana Jones at the same time.
Yeah, that checks out.
Yeah.
And they're both movies that have had point-and-click adventures of them, although that's not really relevant here. But we did also watch a talk by John Ingold from the studio Inkle, where they talked extensively about Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Which I think anyone who's interested in this podcast should watch at some point. I'll put a link to it in the notes, which you'll get on your podcast app. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, it will be in the description. So do you want to try and flesh some of this out for us? I know if people have played this, they'll be familiar with a lot of this, but it is quite a strange universe they've made for us to explore. And that's kind of important here because it's kind of the weirdness of the world that prompts you to want to understand the language in the first place, right?
Yeah. I'll give a brief overview and I'll try not to spoil any main plot points.
But basically, there will be some stuff we say which sounds like a major spoiler.
But it's not.
Because we'll tell you what's kind of the end of the game, but it's not really the plot important end of the game because it sort of works in loops of playing it as a new game plus type game.
Yeah. So the world is basically, it's the universe or the galaxy that you live in is called the Nebula. And it consists of smaller planets, which in the game are called moons. And you can basically travel between those moons on sort of space rivers. So you are, as the main character, this woman called Aliyah, and she has a ship which she can use to travel those rivers and go from moon to moon. And Aliyah is an archaeologist who works at a university on one of the moons, which is called Iox. And what we learn very early on is that she's an orphan from actually a different moon called Elbereth. But when she was 15, this other person from the University of Iox called Professor Mayari came to Elbereth, found her, took her in, brought her to Iox and sort of raised her. So at the start of the game, you, Aliyah, are called back to the university by Mayari, and she shows you a brooch. And the brooch has some writing on it, and she wants you to have a look at that artifact because, as we said, you're an archaeologist. And she says she's received this from another researcher who's called Renbar, but she doesn't know why. She doesn't know why he sent it. And she also doesn't know where he is. So last she heard was that he was also travelling the nebula and he was going to a moon called Myosi. And so you are tasked with finding him and figuring out why he sent that brooch, what's going on. And also, Mayari insists that you take a robot with you. So you've got a little companion from the beginning on. And so what the rest of the game is then going out into the nebula, trying to find out where Renbar is, what he's up to, and eventually you will find out that Renbar is looking for something called Heaven's Vault. And so it goes from finding out where Renbar is to finding out what Heaven's Vault is. And at the very end of the game, you find it, you have a decision to make about Heaven's Vault, and that's how the game ends.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out here that it starts in media res. The first sequence in the game is you finding the Heaven's Vault, whatever that is, and then it flashes back to the start of the journey. I think one of the important things to pick up at the start is that this is a weird world. It's like the planets, these moons, they're tiny. They are like a single village on a moon that is a few miles round. Yeah. It's very, very strange. And you have rivers, and the spaceships are sort of sail driven, and they go along these rivers that are kind of made of water, but also sort of ethereal at the same time. Yeah. It's very strange. And all of this strangeness actually really works very well with the core mechanic, which we'll discuss in a minute, of the way that you decipher the languages, because it kind of takes you through this sort of archaeological linguistic process of initially caring about the language so you can decipher individual pieces of script, and then eventually you start wanting to know the history, which is very different from how like fantasy history is often done in big RPGs, where they just dump loads of it on you, and or they sort of spoon feed you little bits of it as you pick up books. Here there's not really any of that. There's just stuff there for you to decipher. And I think one of the things we'll get into a bit more as well is that the game often doesn't really tell you if your interpretation of the language and what it says is right. Especially when it comes to that longer scale stuff of what was actually happening in this world 1,000 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, so this is another important thing. So, the game ends with you finding Heaven's Vault and making that decision. But getting to the end and finishing doesn't necessarily mean that you have figured out much about what's going on in the world. So you may not know really what Heaven's Vault is, even though you've found it. You may not have found out why Renbar was looking for it, or, the history of the nebula and what's going on with the robots as well. So, again, I'm trying not to spoil this too much, but sort of what you find out quite early on is there are these robots, and as I said, Mayari gives you one and insists that you take it with you. But the important thing is that the robots aren't made by the current civilization. So what seems to be happening in it is that the people are finding those robots buried or sort of cemented into walls, and then they dig them out and they restart them, and they don't really have any sort of memory of what was before. So the big mystery is, where are they coming from? Who made them? Why are they all buried? And that's something that you can find out, but you don't need to find that out in order to get to the end of the game. And the other thing is about sort of the history of the nebula. So what you know at the beginning is that at the moment you are living in what's called the modern age, which has been going on for a couple of hundred years, and that before that was a dark age where we don't really know what was going on. We don't really have any documentation from that. And we also know that the Dark Age started with the fall of the Holy Ioxian Empire. So there was an empire, then there was a fall where there was a revolution and the empire fell, then there was the Dark Age, and now it's the modern age. But we don't really know how that came to be. And part of the history during that period was lost. And the other thing that was lost is knowledge of this language, which is called ancient. So you, at the beginning, you are what you know as a character and as a player is that no one can read that language and no one can speak it. And only a few people know the odd word when they see a symbol. So, as I said at the very beginning, you get this brooch and it has some writing on it, and at the first playthrough, you are immediately able, you look at the symbol and you say, oh, I recognize this, I've seen those symbols before, they mean emperor. And so this is where the replays come in, because once you get to the end, you find Heaven's Vault and you make that decision, the game ends. But you can do replay pluses where you restart the game. And the interesting thing here is that all the translations that you've already figured out are sort of taken over to the next round. So you start already knowing a bigger inventory of words. And the other thing is interesting, that not only that, but the inscriptions that you find actually become longer and more complex as well. So first playthrough, you get that brooch, it has 2 words, one of them that you can translate as emperor. But on my 5th playthrough, yes, I know, you get an entire sentence that you can translate. So the more playthroughs you do, the more translations you will already know, but also the more complex the fragments are and the more information you get about the world and what is going on.
I just wanted to skip back briefly to the robots and the history stuff as well, because part of what this game does so well is it does sort of induce you to think like an archaeologist, and it's not doing that through, oh, here's a mini game and you've got to brush some stuff off a stone, right? It's all through the language. But there are also these interfaces in the game, and if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll show you one now, but there's like a timeline of the history that initially is empty and you gradually populate it, and it's got this crazy sort of like almost logarithmic curve to the zoom on it, where you can zoom into it now and it will say, oh, I think 6 months ago, Remba, this guy I'm looking for, did this. And then you can zoom out and it goes to like the 4,000 years scale kind of thing. And the thing with the robots is like, obviously you've got the real world analog of what archaeologists do with languages, which is, you know, learning about the past from script on objects. But the robots also serve as this kind of, you know, they're a bit of a deus ex machina, because you can have a robot who is a character who was alive during that time. But then they also inject this, and again, without any spoilers, well, I don't even know if I can spoil this because I've only played it once and my understanding of the world is much less complete than yours. But the robots, I mean, having 6 sent with you, I mean, we were both, when we played it together the first time, we were very suspicious of 6.
Yeah.
And
by the way, 6 is the name of the robot. Who's called that because he's the 6th robot that Mayari insists that you take with you. And for some reason, you've lost or broken all the other ones, so you've started numbering them and just calling them by the number,
which is like, it's great. It's really kind of playing around with the idea of like the annoying sidekick, like Scrappy Doo or something, and making it quite deliberate. And it also sets up this dynamic between the player character and the professor at the university that is very similar to the kind of cop and supervisor thing in old cop movies, or like Peter Parker and his boss at the Daily Planet, that kind of like, oh, you're a loose cannon, you keep breaking everything I'm giving you, kind of. The first conversation you have with her sets up this dynamic of like, oh, you're really good at this job that you do. You know, there's a thing where the space travel is really limited and not many people have ships, and it's sort of very strongly implied that the university doesn't want people to travel around, and you're one of the only people that has this privilege. And so you have this kind of, again, coming back to Harrison Ford, you're this sort of Han Solo kind of, you're working for what appear to be the forces of good or order in this universe, but you're a bit of a rogue agent kind of thing. So that brings our Harrison Ford thing out into a triangle now. Nice. But it's got this kind of, you're excavating the past through script on objects, and then you also have the robots functioning as possible containers for this language, and then there's a seed of doubt about whether they really don't remember stuff or whether it's hidden, and how reliable
exactly anything is. Also, even the scripts, like the fragments that you find, which is something that comes up in the game, maybe not explicitly, but this idea that history is written by the winners, right? And how much can you actually trust any of this information that you find? And, as you find stuff, the character can also figure out from what period is that. And so you get pieces from different periods that tell you different things about the world, which is quite interesting. Yeah,
it's quite sophisticated in that sense. And I think writing in games has got better in this regard in the past like 10, 20 years, since narrative design got a bit more professionalized. But it used to be that when you found lore books in a universe in a game, it was like they all had the same authorial voice, and it was just like, this is what happened. One of the notable examples of that not happening is in the Elder Scrolls, so in Skyrim and stuff like that. A lot of the books were written by forum members way back, like four games ago. And that means you naturally get these competing descriptions of history and how their god pantheon works and stuff. Yeah. Which is great, because, I mean, it depends what you're aiming for, but it does map onto exactly what you're saying, this real world history is written by the victors. And in this world, in Heaven's Vault, you really get the sense of there being different factions with different views on who is God, or the relation, the god emperor type thing that kind of like the ancient Egyptians had. But you do have to sort of try and develop a understanding of who lived where on which moons and what their relationship to the emperor might have been, and what they might have called them, different things and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk a bit about the script more specifically? Because we've talked a bit about, you're deciphering this thing, but like, what does that actually look like to do on the screen?
Yeah, I can do that. So if you look at a piece of writing, you will see a line of signs or characters that don't look like anything that's in our real world, right? So they are not...
They're squiggly wiggles.
They're squiggly wiggles. And so those signs all run together. So there is no gaps between words, right? So if you are translating, the first step is always to figure out where does one word end and where does the next one start. And so I think if we start with the sort of smallest unit, what do those signs represent? So we figure out quite quickly that those signs are not alphabetical. So they're not letters like we have it in English, for instance, where a letter corresponds to a specific sound, roughly, and you combine sounds and letters to make words. So, we have the Latin alphabet that we use in most European languages.
So to give an example, in English, we might add the prefix "un" to another word to say that it's not the thing, right? UN, and that's made of letters which make a sound.
Yes.
Whereas in this language, we might have a particular mark that you might eventually work out means not, and then you'll be able to use it like "un." But there's no point in this game where we understand that that mark means a particular sound.
Yes.
So there's no relationship to an alphabet or particular phonetic information.
Exactly.
We do hear a few words written out in English at various points in the game, but not enough to actually map them onto any of these symbols.
Well, not in English, right?
Yeah, but in the alphabet, right? So written out phonetically in our alphabet. We do see that a few times.
Yes.
But it's not enough to actually understand any relationship between our phonetics and letters and what this language reads out loud as.
Yes, well, this is the interesting thing, because at the beginning, you learn... Mayari asks you to look at this brooch because she knows you have, a few of the words and can you decipher it. But, as far as people in this world know, knowledge of ancient is lost. No one can really read it properly, and definitely no one speaks it anymore, right? Now, I don't know how much we found this out during the first playthrough, but it definitely becomes more prominent the more often I've played it, that this is not actually true, that no one speaks it anymore. And there is a spoken equivalent of ancient. And one of the things that you can do as a player that's not within the game, but you can sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and try to figure out how the spoken words map onto the written words. So that's something maybe I'll do for my sixth playthrough.
So it's worth pointing out this point is that because the game often doesn't tell you 100% when you're accurate. I mean, it does lock certain words in when you get them. But for a long time, there was been a Discord for this game after it came out, and the community on there were working together, almost like they were playing an ARG, to sort of share theories about probably initially the language and then later on the world. When we played this together the first time, we scribbled lots, right? Do we still have that somewhere?
Somewhere, yeah.
I will try and put scans of it on the YouTube if I can, because it makes us look like crazy people, and that's quite fun.
Yeah, so getting back to those signs that you see, they're not alphabetical letters. Instead, what they are really ideographs. So that means you have a sign that represents not a sound, but a concept. So if you think of Arabic numerals, for instance, right, that sign that we think means one, that means a concept, and you can use it in different languages. So, for instance, you have a sign in ancient here that's two horizontal wavy lines, and you can figure out that sign means either water or liquid or something like that.
And some modern languages still have this, right? So in some East Asian languages, you will have a tree that looks like a tree, and multiple trees will mean a forest, but it's...
To some degree, although those are often more logographic, which means that the one sign, like in Chinese, for instance, or Japanese, a sign is actually a word. Whereas here, the signs are concepts, and then you combine them to make words, so it's slightly different. But a lot of those, what are now sign means word symbols in Chinese, for instance, they started out often as ideographic signs and then became something else.
So to just run back past the difference between ideograms or ideographs and an alphabetic language, if you go back to the concept of the number 1, when we write the single character that represents 1,
Yeah.
that doesn't really represent the sound of the word 1.
No,
which we write O-N-E.
Yeah.
And that's the sound, but the single character represents the number rather than the sound.
Yeah, which is why you can use why a lot of languages use just that 1 in their language, but if they say it out loud, they would say a different word, right? Because it means a concept and not a specific word in the language.
Yeah.
Yes, so we have those concepts, and those 2 lines, those wiggly lines that mean liquid or water, are like transparent to some degree that you can work it out from looking at it. But some of them are more abstract where you can't really make the connection. And overall, we have a fairly limited number of those signs that the language is made up of. So there are only 46 in total. And roughly there are 3 categories of signs. You have numerals, so you have a sign for all the numbers between 0 and 9. The second category is grammatical concepts. So you have a sign that means action or verb. You have a sign that means a thing or a noun. Then you have one for like question words. You have one for and. As you said earlier, you have one that means not or negation. And the interesting thing is that there is a bit of wiggle room with a lot of these, right? So you have one that means either action or verb, or you have negation or not. So they are not entirely fixed.
So for example, I know this isn't a real example from the game, but you could have the concept of water, and if you modified that with a symbol that turned it into a verb, it could mean swim or drink or something like that. And the word swim or drink would still contain that symbol for water within itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have numerals, grammaticals, and then we have general concepts like, the one that means water, liquid. Then we have another one that means nature or plant. So overall, just 46 of those. And the next step is going from those signs that mean concepts to getting to the actual words. What you do in this language is you combine multiple of the signs. So, as you just said, to go from the concept of water or liquid to the actual word water, what you have to do in the language is you have to combine 2 signs, namely the sign for noun or thing with the sign for water. So noun water gives you the word water. But if you combine the sign for water or liquid with the sign for verb or action, you get the word drink. Now, obviously, as you said, drink plus verb plus water could be all kinds of things, right? It could be drink, it could be swim, it could be wash, right? And I guess in a lot of ways, this goes back to the fact that this is not a full language, right? So you have only a limited number of words within this world as well, where I can see that this method of making words might become problematic if you try to come up with a fully fledged language.
Yeah, but then it also suits the purposes of the game for wash and drink to be malleable and for it to not be clear which one you're actually getting.
I don't think we have I don't remember if we would have come across the word wash.
No.
Or swim in this world, right? But another one that's quite interesting, because I looked some of these up, is the way that they made the word wet, for instance, is 3 signs. It's quality of water. The way that they made...
It's like the Zoolander. You know on Zoolander where he's doing the water is the essence of cleanliness or something. Yeah, that bit. Yeah.
But if you only... So that's quality of water. But if you have only quality water, that's fast, because water runs fast, I would guess. So you can already see that this way of making words is a bit limited, because water can have a lot of qualities, right? And then you have to come up with a way of making different kinds of qualities into words.
Yeah, it's idiosyncratic, but like with my game designer head on, I'm often not an advocate for things being realistic, right? So if you were going to make a game about language, then having a realistic depiction of language and its idiosyncrasies isn't necessarily inherently good.
Yeah.
But this is an example of where that works really, really well, because you both get an idiosyncratic language, which they often are. I mean, we are currently speaking English, which is insanely idiosyncratic language a lot of the time in terms of how it mixes things from different sources and...
Well, that's just
what languages be like.
That's just history for you.
History is written by the victors, and
in whatever language
is written completely randomly by a bunch of weirdos.
Yeah.
But it serves the game very, very well, because even after you've played for hours and hours and you think you know what this word definitively means, you might see the same symbols used in a different context to be a part of another word, and within that larger word they don't mean the same thing that they meant in that earlier word. Yeah,
or they mean more. So this is quite interesting. So if you want to say the word water, right, and it's the sign for noun and the sign for water or liquid, right, that's water. And those are sort of the most basic words, where you have a concept sign and a grammatical sign combined. But then you can have lots of words that are more complex. So there is no sign for blood, for instance. So if you want to write the word blood, what you have to do is make a compound that is noun plus life plus liquid.
Mm-hmm.
So, translating it would be the thing that is life water, right?
Yeah.
That's blood.
Yeah.
So in a lot of cases, those words are like compounds of different concepts, and sometimes those compounds are quite descriptive. So the word for fish, for instance, literally translates creature water or animal water. So you have, creature of the water is fish. But then, blood, describing blood as life liquid is a bit more poetic and metaphorical.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how the language works. Those more complex compounds. And then, as you said, the most complex ones are where you have words nested within larger words. So they might consist of a quite long list of those signs. For instance, the word gate, if you look at it and you just look at the individual signs that the word gate is made out of, you have, in this order, noun, quality, of, many, noun, verb, light, motion.
Yeah, it's like algebraic equations, right? And one of the conceits that they add for the gameplay here to make this work is when the player character feels that she definitively knows a word, the game tells you and it locks it in, right? And it's like, this word now, which obviously isn't a thing that would really happen, but it's necessary for the game to feel in any way satisfying or like you're making progress.
Yeah.
But like we just said, that word can then become like a bracketed concept within one of these algebraic equations within another word, where it does still make sense in that context if you pick apart the whole word, but you can't just drop it in and say, oh, that says fish, because actually within this larger word, it's serving a slightly different job.
Yeah. So if you look at this long list of signs that make up gate, what you really have to figure out is that how it is nested is that within this list, the signs verb, light, and motion actually mean open. And then noun, verb, light, motion means entrance. Quality of many means big. So what you really have is noun, big, entrance.
Yeah.
which is gate.
With the language having a conflation between amount and size is confusing. But to be fair, we do that in English, right? We do that with things like great.
Yeah.
And which it's confusing, but it's how real languages operate as well.
Yeah, volume, right? Great volume.
Yeah.
So when we think about what is it that we try to figure out about this ancient language, it's really the areas of linguistics that are called morphology and semantics. So semantics is the meaning of words, and morphology is the structure of words. So how are words combined? How are parts of words, which we call morphemes, combined to make a word? And in this case, it's figuring out those constituency parts, individual signs, and how they are nested within bigger words, and like, as you said, bracketed like algebraic formulae. Yeah,
it's like the language has its own BODMAS or BIDMAS rule for what order you read a word in.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because the way that I then started to figure it out while playing it was actually starting reading inscriptions from the back rather than from the front, because that helped with figuring out those compounds for some reason.
But that also requires you to know where the words start because they don't have any gaps, right?
Yes.
So that can make it painful.
Yeah.
But once you know that a symbol is usually a prefix, like we talked about the prefix for not, you know that that's not going to be the last symbol in one of these constructions.
Yeah,
most
I'm
of the
trying
time.
to remember if that's true or whether it can start with that. I don't really know. Yeah, but there are some signs which don't come usually, or those grammatical markers of verb, noun, adjective. They are very often at the beginning of a word, although they might also be at the beginning of a word that's nested within a bigger word, so that might be deceptive. But you can sort of figure out eventually where might be a good point that's the end of one word and the beginning of the next one. And the other interesting thing is that you don't have to worry about word order. So you're not trying to figure out what's called the syntax of the language, right? The structure in terms of sentence structure.
Oh yeah, because that is basically English,
yes,
right?
When you translate it, once you translate all the words, you have a perfectly grammatical English sentence.
If there's a sentence that says the rivers flow to the sun or something, it's going to be in English once you translate it. It won't have a different word order like we'd have in German or something like that. Yeah.
So, do you want to talk a bit more about like the translation process for both the player but also the sort of mechanic? You already said the game locks in translations eventually, but it depends on how much of the language your character already knows, right?
Yeah, so there's like multiple levels to this, isn't there? Because you have an interface where you can see the inscription and then you select sections of the inscription.
Yeah.
And then you have multiple choice responses to this. So
sometimes, right?
Sometimes.
Well, if you know enough, then the game will suggest 3 options that it might be. So if you already know like a smaller word and there is a bigger word that has that as one of its component, right? It might suggest like this could mean slave or enslaved or escape, right?
So to give an example that I do remember from the game, the combination of poison and animal, if you know those 2 words, in the 3 words that come up as suggestions, snake will probably be in there.
Yeah.
And then if you select that and it's correct, then
because
it basically
snake
locks
is,
it in.
I think, poison animal.
Yeah, or something like that. So you have this kind of micro level of, you've basically got a player dictionary that locks in words once you know them, and you are picking out parts of the script you're reading, and if you already know those words, they can be locked in immediately. And if you don't know them, it sort of gives you choices, like multiple choice. And I think one of the things this game should be commended for is like how easy it is to interact with. And this has been a common thing with all of Inkle's games. Like 80 Days is such a wordy game, and I played it on a mobile, but they're so good at breaking down the amount of text you've got to read that they have such a strong emphasis on how their kind of UI and UX presents and chunks information, because I tend to find on a horizontal landscape screen, if you give me reams and reams of text to read and it goes all the way across the page, I just immediately turned off. They do it really well in this game. The dialogue's broken down really small, and when you start this game, you get smaller fragments, so it gets harder for you, but it becomes more satisfying because you know more of the language. And there's basically two levels of knowledge. There's what the player character authoritatively has locked into their dictionary, and you can play the game entirely on that and just guessing, and I'm sure lots of people will have played it that way. But then we were playing it at the level of trying to decipher what the individual units within the word mean, which the game doesn't actually give you anything to do that with, right? The only mechanics within the game are, like I said, it sort of confirms when a word is correct, and it will give you suggestions for the other words to choose from based on what the character knows is adjacent to that in terms of the related symbols and what you know so far. And the whole stuff we've talked about so far about actually deciphering the language and working out the individual components and how they relate to each other isn't actually explicitly in the game. It's happening at another level, which is it's really interesting. It kind of really means that the player, if they want to enjoy the game on that level, you have to be engaged in a level of deduction that is just not even in the game. And I think that's a really incredible achievement for them to make a game that operates on both those levels, because you can play this game just as a guessing game and enjoy it as a point and click adventure and not go into super deep, I'm an archaeologist, linguist person. All of that is happening at the level of the player's mind, and as I said before, in the communities that followed this game. It's very similar to actually what happens with FromSoft games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls with their lore, where they are sort of deliberately very oblique about everything, and it creates this whole fan culture of trying to decipher a thing by making the thing incomplete in the text itself, which I find, and obviously that's not going to work in really mass market media that's trying to be accessible, but that's not really what this is about. Making a game where you're invited to act as a real linguist would, or a real archaeologist would, is not going to be super accessible, because it's requiring you to think rather than to perform a sequence of button actions in a skillful way or whatever.
Yeah, it is very interesting. As you said, the game will eventually tell you whether you figured out what certain words mean, but there is nothing in the game that actually tells you what the individual signs mean. So, as you said, there is a sign that means not or negation, right? The only way to figure that out is if you sit down and you deconstruct the words, and then you can figure out, I think that this particular sign means not or negation, right? Which is what we had. We had eventually a list of all the individual signs and trying to figure out what those parts meant, which actually can get you to a very interesting position that we've had a few times where the character in your game has not translated or confirmed enough words for the game to even give you a suggestion of what a specific word means. But we can work it out because we know what the individual signs mean. So that is quite interesting.
It creates a dramatic irony. And then just to cap that off, I think then there's the level above that, which we haven't got into too much because it's spoiler territory, but again, this game does a really good job of eventually making you care about the lore and the history of the universe, because the language, some of the languages, or not the language itself, but some of the things the language says in certain contexts doesn't really make sense until you start trying to think about the history of this universe and who these robots were, who the Emperor was, who other powerful entities within the history of this world have been. And the other thing, and I think this is even advertised on the Inkle website for this, is that characters in this world have stakes and they lie to you. And I won't say anything about who any of those are, but you meet lots of different characters. There's lots of different sort of socioeconomic positions within this world. It has a sort of caste system within it, if you can call it that.
Yeah.
And there are people vying for power. And when you first enter this world, your character has a sort of, like I said, that kind of renegade cop, anti-authoritarian, but part of this system kind of position, which allows them to move between all of these social places and interact with these people. But it also means that lots of people have incentives to lie to you or lead you down, feed you false information or lead you in particular directions. And again, the way of playing this, where you just guess until the game tells you got the right answer, and you just kind of there's not I think maybe if you play it that way, this game is probably not very satisfying, because there's nothing that pops up even if you follow that route, there's nothing that pops up later on and says, well done, you did everything right. Yeah. There are dilemmas in the game that even the dilemma itself isn't comprehensible if you don't go some way to understanding the history and understanding what's going on in this world, which is not spoon-fed to you. And it's not like, Fallout 3, hey, do you want to blow up the town or not?
Yeah.
It's like being presented with a dilemma with 2 or 3 possible solutions, and if you haven't been paying attention for a few hours, you don't even understand what the implications of your choices are. Which, again, if you've been engaging with it on this other level of caring about the history, which I often do not when I play games, like I love Elden Ring. I'm playing it again at the moment. I could not tell you who any of these bosses are or how they relate to each other or what happened in this world. It's just a bunch of sad people in castles who you go in and beat up. So, it takes a lot to get me to care about that stuff. But I think because this game is so focused on it, it's not an action game with archaeology strapped onto it. It's just a game that is purely about linguistics and history and nothing else.
Yeah, and that's what the satisfying thing about it is. And as I said earlier, you can complete it in quotation marks and get to the end and not know what the hell actually is going on, right? And yes, you've completed the game, but have you really?
Now, I'm looking at what's next on our show notes, and I'm slightly scared because Ibby has just written the word quiz, and then there's a bunch of text that I can't read because she's used the digital equivalent of invisible ink. So I'm gonna be tortured now in some way, I think.
Yeah. So I just thought it would be fun to read some of the concept constituent translations to Joe and make him guess what that word means in this world. And I'm not going for the most fine-grained gate where it's impossible to figure it out. Okay, so
thanks.
I'm gonna give you a chance. We have some verbs, then we have some nouns, and then we have some creatures.
Okay.
So the
3 food groups.
Yes.
Yeah.
The first one is verb query speak.
Verb query speak. So is query a noun or is it a...
It's a concept.
Okay. I mean, to question, to ask.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we have verb possession not.
To lose?
See, that's very good, and that's where you get one of the issues with the language where that would make sense, but actually it translates as to want or need.
Oh yeah, that was one of the things we found in this language, is that tenses are very loose.
Yes.
So
there are no...
So needing is kind of like the forward-looking version of losing, right? If you...
There's only one tense marker, and that's for past tense. Everything else is either present or future.
You would basically to say that something like the emperor will triumph, right? You would basically have to make a construction that says in the future the emperor triumphs, because there's no future tense. There's only a present tense and a past tense.
Yeah, I think there might be a will, but I'm not quite sure.
That makes sense. But yeah, it means that you always have to use will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, next one. Verb share life.
Is it like coexist?
a specific kind of coexisting. Well, that's a good one, yeah? It's to marry.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very simple word for something that people don't do that often.
Yeah. I quite like the next one. Verb, song, happy.
Song happy.
Mm-hmm.
It's doing a happy song.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just singing, though, is it?
No.
Is it celebrating
No.
or partying?
No, it's laughing.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, those are the sorts of things that really give this language a poetry,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
For laughter to be described as a song,
As a happy song.
like bird song is,
Yeah.
right? Birds don't really know they're singing, but we
Yeah.
describe it as a song
Yeah.
because it's a joyous sound. That's really lovely.
Yeah. Okay, last verb. Verb, jump, think.
Verb, jump, think.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a real mishmash of types of thing. Is it having an idea?
No.
Is it ideate?
No.
Ibby hates the word ideate because I work in design and we use that word all the time, and it's one of those recently made up design business words. What was it? Verb, jump,
Think.
verb, jump, think. Assume.
Very close. It's to guess.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a bit like jumping to conclusions,
or
right?
making a logical leap.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
I like that one.
Yeah. Okay, nouns. Noun, water, still.
Noun, water, still. A lake or a pond?
No,
So it's
but
a
very
thing
very
where water is not moving.
yeah, very good guess though. It's ice.
So still meaning solid in this.
Yeah.
Just
Noun, star, idea.
so idea and a star are both already nouns. So it's a noun. It's a thing
Yeah.
that combines those things. And a star could mean a different thing in this world because, as far as we know in this world, there is no universe outside the nebula. At least that's what the characters would generally think. So, I have no idea with that. Hang on, give me a second. Is it all of the lyrics to Starman?
No, unfortunately not.
It's not?
It's a wish or hope.
Oh, that's cute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we get to some creatures.
Okay. I
Okay.
like creatures.
Yeah. Creature, many leg.
A spider
Yeah.
or an insect? Yeah.
Yeah. Creature, happy earth.
A worm?
No, but very good.
A mole?
No.
Oh, a pig.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, very minor spoiler alert. There's a planet full of pigs.
There's a planet
It's the first
full of
place you go,
pigs.
yeah.
And I'm trying to think, is that the only animal we see in the game?
I don't know. I mean, again, these moons are so small that when they have any kind of agricultural culture, it's like the whole planet is that.
Yeah,
It's
but I
just
can't remember any other animals.
That's the sort of
Oh no,
pigs
there's a
and
gecko.
rice.
There's a gecko.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Pig. Okay. Creature, tiny pig.
A mole or a mouse?
Very good. It's a rabbit.
Okay, tiny pig.
And then the last one, creature, very tiny pig.
That one is a mouse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's lovely. I mean, one thing that we didn't say up the front, but you might have guessed from a lot of the names in this, that one of the things that this does, I'm going to put my cultural studies head back on, is that a lot of the stuff in this game is kind of Arabic coded.
Yeah.
Like the characters have names and appearances that we would think of as Middle Eastern, the university and
The architecture in a lot of places, yeah.
exactly. And I think what this achieves, and Inkle have done this with their other games as well. So 80 Days is a sort of notoriously colonialist story originally, and they had the narrative designer Meg Gianthin on that, and they sort of deliberately made it this kind of, what if steampunk wasn't that? What if steampunk's well, steampunk now is a bit more kind of diverse, but what if this story from the 1800s, or maybe it was written before that, I don't know where Vern is from, maybe actually there's all these different parts of the world, and India and Saudi Arabia had all of these cool steampunk technologies that reflected their own local culture.
Yeah.
That's really cool, and that's something the studio has consistently done. But what we see here is this sci-fi that is, everything is from that world. So it's not like Star Wars or Dune, where you get kind of Arabicness used to encode the other.
Yeah.
So like I mean in Star Wars you've got Tatooine, which is literally some village in Algeria where it was filmed, and I think the planet is just named after that place it was filmed, and it's such a common trope in sci-fi and fantasy to just take a culture that's not European and make it the other.
Yeah.
And here it's not even that there are two cultures and one is the other, that we just see different sort of, not necessarily Middle Eastern, but like Occidental cultures on these different moons, and there isn't anything in this game that maps onto European or Eurocentrism.
No, there's no sense that there are different ethnicities at all. Like the characters all look sort of like they're all the same ethnicity, right?
Yeah.
And then the only difference is that those little moons, planet moons, have different ecosystems, right? So that's different, and based on the ecosystem, you have rich moons and you have poor moons, right? So it's much more socioeconomic differences rather than ethnic
which are cosmically driven in ways that I don't want to spoil.
Yeah.
But if you haven't played the game yet, working out how all of that works is really part of the fun, and it's so strange. And normally if you told me, in this game there's a nebula and it's rivers that run between planets and you sail on them, I'd think, okay, that's cool, but it's just sort of weird for the sake of it. Here it structures everything.
Yeah.
And it also gives you reason to want to understand all of this stuff in the history that you can only access through the language. And because it's not based on tropes, because it is such a weird take on this kind of galactic science fantasy, you don't have what you have in a lot of fantasy where it's just riffing on Tolkien and, you know, like, I know that the dwarves live underground and the elves live in forests, and I've already got tropes to sort of lay out a bunch of stuff for me. Even though this might initially look like it's going to be a Dune or it's going to be a Star Wars, it's so out there in some of the ways in which this world is constructed, but the way it all comes together to make a puzzle where all of these things are interconnected, like the deep history, the current socioeconomic conditions that the people you meet live in. I mean, there's one town that is very similar to the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, where people are living in sort of shanties that are look like they're made out of corrugated metal and fabric and stuff like that. So there is a socioeconomics to this world, but there isn't a sense of like you say, like empires that have ethnicities mapped onto them in that way. So I think that was just something I wanted to make sure that we covered. We looked to see if anyone had written linguistics research papers about this.
Yeah, there's nothing I could find. I saw that the game is mentioned in a couple of papers that are more from an archaeological perspective. But I couldn't find anything on the language. Nothing linguistic-y.
Yeah, so if you're listening to this because you're at grad school now and you're a budding ludo-linguist, I'm sure someone's used that term before, but I'm going to pretend I made it up. then maybe this is for you, or maybe we'll get there before you. I don't know.
We just get automatic transcripts of this podcast and submit it to some journal.
Yeah, exactly. In the language, we'll translate it with the 46 symbols. As always, thanks for listening. This is only our second episode, so if you've just stumbled across this one and you haven't heard the first one...
Fear not, there isn't much.
Fear not, there isn't much, but last month we talked about Dungeons and Dragons, we talked about the languages in Dungeons and Dragons, we kind of pick them apart, what's cool about them, what's lacking, and how that's necessary to serve the game. And we talked a little bit about Baldur's Gate 3 as well. But each episode of this podcast, we're going to be covering some sort of link between games and linguistics. And sometimes we might be breaking down a specific game like we've done today. And there might be other times where we talk about broader concepts. So we start with the linguistics or we start with the cultural studies, and then we talk about various different games in relation to that. If you want any more information about the stuff we've talked about, if you're on a podcasting platform like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, there will be some links in the show notes for you to look at on there on the podcast description. And likewise, if you are listening/watching to the slightly more visual version of this on the YouTube, then same thing, have a look in the description, any links will be there. And if you're on YouTube and you want to subscribe to this so you can listen to it on podcasting platforms in future and get recommendations for when it appears, then the RSS feed will be there for you to subscribe as well.
Yeah, good. That's all for today.
Yeah, until next time, keep gaming
and speaking.
And speak. And see you all soon. Bye.
Okie dokie.
Let's stand by the
So yeah, no metronome, and I'm pressing record now.
Now, and whenever I do a presentation, I do it to a metronome.
But then you'll start rapping if you do that.
Yeah, well, but maybe that'll get people's attention.